Shortly after posting a series of DLSS 5 videos, Nvidia's Jacob Freeman reacted through email, basically trying to clarify some of the questions I had about DLSS 5. Now, his initial answers honestly look like a lot of the information that was already publicly available, where they describe what DLSS 5 is trying to do and what tools the developers have to control the implementation. The problem I have is that a lot of these sound like they're implying something that might not actually be what's happening. And so I then took him up on the offer to being happy to answer any other questions I may have, to ask a series of follow-up questions. Now, most of my follow-up questions are getting at really what is DLSS 5 actually taking as an input that it's working with to then create the output that you see on your screen when you're playing the game. Because here's the problem. When they describe it as reconstructing lighting, and not affecting the underlying geometry and textures, and enhancing PBR properties on materials, that sounds like the DLSS 5 model is really aware of what the game is doing. Like it's taking a lot of inputs from the game engine. And in my initial reaction video, where there was less information publicly available, the part of this, I had a lot of questions about artistic intent, and do we really want the characters to look like this? I said in some games like Starfield, okay, honestly, the originals were pretty ugly. But at that point, Nvidia hadn't published further information. And as more information came out, I was like, wait, this doesn't sound like it's actually understanding the underlying geometry, textures, and reconstructing lighting based on a 3D environment. What these images look like is you just took a screenshot of the game and fed it through an AI image generator that says enhance. And so that's what I was trying to get at with this question. Is this DLSS 5 model actually understanding the 3D geometry, textures, and materials that are in the game, and better understanding how light interacts with that, which is kind of what statements like this imply, and what I was initially somewhat positive about when I thought that's what it was doing based on it being described like this. But then, is it really just a screenshot of the game with motion vectors, and then it's running it through an AI image generator? That's what I was trying to get at with this question, because that is much less exciting and potentially extremely problematic, as evidenced by the reaction to all of this on the internet. So that's the question I'm asking. My biggest question is whether or not this model is effectively taking a single 2D frame as an input with motion vectors to create the output frame. This then relates to some clarifying questions about the information you provided, which I asked below. Okay, so my question is DLSS 5 essentially just taking a single 2D frame with motion vectors to generate the output frame? The answer is yeah, that's what it's doing. Okay, yes, DLSS 5 takes a 2D frame plus motion vectors as input. In other words, the accusation that what DLSS 5 is essentially doing is taking a screenshot of the game and then running it through an AI image, generative AI, to enhance it. Yeah, that is what it's doing. That's how I would read this. I don't think I'm misinterpreting that. It's taking a 2D frame plus the motion vectors to better understand how it's going to move to the next frame to try to keep things consistent, right? But it's essentially applying an AI image generator to enhance the actual rendered frame of the game. And by enhance, that could be depending on what you would consider enhance, and by the reactions we've seen to the output that we're getting. And I asked some questions about that and artistic intent as follow-ups. Anyway, so here's my second question. So you say the underlying geometry and textures are unchanged. Is the model actually aware of things like 3D geometry, 3D depth, etc., or is it essentially just looking at a 2D image and then reinterpreting it similar to taking a screenshot of a game and asking an AI model to enhance the screenshot to make it more realistic? So I was really trying to get very direct with that question. Is this essentially just taking a screenshot of a 2D image of your game and asking AI to enhance it? The response DLSS 5 is trained end-to-end to understand complex scene semantics such as characters, hair, fabric, and translucent skin, along with the environment lighting conditions like frontlit, backlit, or overcast, all by analyzing a single frame. So that last line is key. Remember that yes, DLSS 5 takes a 2D frame plus motion vectors as input, so the only real response to this can be that it tries its best to infer what's happening, regarding lighting, where light is coming from, etc., by looking at that 2D image. Essentially, think of it as kind of like a screenshot of one frame of your game. But that is all it's working off of. So it's just the generative AI inferring something off of a screenshot, essentially, is how I would read that. My next question is trying to get into, so if generative AI is generating an image based on another image, can't it just change stuff? For example, this character here. So here's how I phrase the question. You say that with DLSS 5, the underlying geometry and textures are unchanged. However, in one of the publicly available examples, it looks like a character grew hair in a place where it didn't exist before. This seems to be a change to the model geometry and/or textures rather than just an enhancement of the lighting. In other words, it seems like an AI image generator reinterpreting the character, which can cause actual details to be changed. It also appears like some characters gain makeup that the original model did not seem to be wearing, which seems like changing the underlying textures. And I included this screenshot in the email where I show that this Starfield character seems to not have hair right here. And after DLSS 5 is applied, it seems to have hair here. So in other words, it seems like an AI image generator is just taking this image and making a new version of it that does not fully respect all of the details of the character that was in the original that was in the original game. So the response is the underlying geometry is unchanged. Also worth mentioning, this is a very early preview of the tech. Okay, so they're saying the underlying geometry is unchanged. So here's my issue with that response. So by underlying geometry, all this model actually understands, due to the response to my first question, is it has this picture. It literally just has this picture to work off of, as well as a motion vector of where it's moving toward, where objects in the scene are moving towards in the next frame, right? So that's all it has to go off of. So it looks at this. I think what they mean by underlying geometry is the game engine itself and what it's rendering. Yeah, it's not changing the geometry the game engine is rendering, but then it generates an AI image that is interpreting that using generative AI. Generative AI is trained on a bunch of like images. What generative AI is doing to make this face is it has been trained on a bunch of faces. So it is going to take this face and it's trying to make a version of this face that has, they say they're trying to train it on more realistic lighting. And I mean, I would argue that the output image is more photorealistic, but it's also taking in the way other people look that are not this character in this game as part of that training data. And maybe those people with this style of haircut had more of a fade where the hair faded out more smoothly, whereas this seems like more like a sharp line cut. In other words, it seems to have, it hasn't physically changed the render of the game, but you're not going to see this render of the game. You're going to see this one if you're using DLSS 5. So while they're saying that the underlying geometry is unchanged, I don't think that they're saying that you're going to see it necessarily, because the AI image generator could simply choose to put something else on top of it. It's painting a 2D picture over the 2D output frame the game actually did. Like, that's what this is doing. And you won't see the one the game they actually made. You'll see the the generative AI interpretation of it. So that's my reading on that. Now, they also say it's a very early preview of the tech. Okay, but you chose to show it off in this state. Hopefully they take a lot of feedback from all of this. Anyway, so I also talked about PBR properties on materials, because again, I feel like a lot of their initial statements, which sound more exciting, are not entirely true, or at least not in the way they're implying when you initially read them, because they say it does things like enhance PBR properties on materials. So For me, if something enhances PBR properties of materials, that means it actually understands what the game programmers programmed for the PBR properties. So I wanted clarification on that, because how does a 2D frame, if that's what it was inputting, which it turns out it was, actually include that information? So I say it enhances, you say it enhances PBR properties on materials. I ask, is it aware of the PBR properties by reading them from the game engine in some way, or is it just looking at the output image and then inferring them? In other words, it is my understanding that game artists traditionally tell a shader what specific parts of a 3D model look like by giving it properties like metallic, roughness, normal maps to simulate bumpiness, etc. Is DLSS 5 taking those artist-created values as inputs, or is it inferring them from something more like the final output image? Again, is this essentially just taking a screenshot of the game and asking generative AI what it thinks that should look like if it was more realistic, instead of actually reading the PBR properties? Because I feel like if it's not actually reading the PBR properties, this feels like a very misleading marketing statement. So the response to that question is DLSS 5 only takes the rendered frame and motion vectors as inputs. Materials are inferred from the rendered frame. So in other words, it doesn't actually read PBR information. So in other words, like when you look at this, there is PBR information programmed in the game engine about this texture, right? The DLSS 5 is not reading any of that input. It's just taking a look at this and deciding what it thinks it would look like if it was more realistic. It's not actually reading the actual PBR properties, which, in my opinion, makes the statement about PBR properties specifically to be a misleading statement, in my opinion. So this now really gets more into artistic intent, which is really the big question with all of this. So developer control over artistic intent. Here's my question. When you describe the tools the developers have to control the model, it does not sound like there is actually a lot of control over the DLSS 5 model's interpretation of the artistic intent of a scene beyond color grading, or turning DLSS 5 off or down on some or all elements of the scene. So for context, this is the reply he gave me in his initial email, as well as this is pretty much what is publicly available at this point. So when they talk about the tools developers have, they say that there's intensity, which is alpha blending to control the mix between the original engine frame and the model's enhanced output. So basically, you can say like some kind of like percentage slider between the original output image that the game rendered versus the generative AI. Color grading, so you can adjust contrast, saturation, and gamma, and then masking off specific areas or elements where DLSS 5 should not be applied. So what I'm saying is, okay, so you can basically adjust the color grading or turn DLSS 5 off or down on some or all elements of the scene. The problem is, what about actual artistic intent beyond color grading? Is artistic intent just color grading? Because that sounds like the only control they really have here. Here's how I phrased it in the email question. For example, in the opening scene of Resident Evil Requiem, Grace is a character, and by the way, I'm getting into, I guess you could call this plot spoilers, but it's literally like the opening scene of the game. Anyway, for example, in the opening scene of Resident Evil Requiem, Grace is a character with a lot of trauma, who is reluctantly on her way to investigate a murder in the same location where her mother was murdered several years earlier. With DLSS 5 off, I get more of that impression of the character. With DLSS 5 on, while she does seem to have more photorealistic lighting and skin, it also looks like she is wearing makeup that was not present in the original version. This gives off a very different impression of the character and emotional impact of the scene. Can developers actually control anything about the output image besides color grading? If they see the DLSS 5 output and want to tweak it, like asking it to not apply makeup to the character, are they able to do so? So see, what I'm getting at here is they say they're trying to work with developers to preserve artistic intent, but it sounds like all they have is on off or color grading or something between on and off, like less intense. So in other words, if a developer is working with DLSS 5 and they're looking at this scene and they're like, oh crap, we don't want Grace to look like she's dressed up to go out for a dinner date with a whole bunch of makeup. She's on her way to the scene of her mother's death where another grisly murder has applied. She is not getting dressed up. Like it doesn't make sense for her to look like this in this scene. Can the developer ask it to do something else? Can they say, make it realistic but less makeup? Can you ask it, can you prompt it like that? That's what I'm trying to get at. And the answer is developers will have detailed controls such as intensity and color grading. Artists can use these controls to adjust blending, contrast, saturation, and gamma, and determine where and how enhancements are applied to maintain the game's unique aesthetic. Developers can also mask specific objects or areas to be excluded from enhancement. We continue to talk to developers to understand all the ways they would like to control the technology. Ultimately, we see Nvidia DLSS 5 as a tool for them to achieve their artistic vision, rather than be limited by the capabilities of traditional real-time rendering. So my opinion of that response is there's no way for the developer to say that Grace shouldn't be wearing makeup here. Am I misreading that? Anyway, next question. I asked, is this model limited to screen space, or does it have any awareness of the environment outside of what is visible in an individual game frame? Again, getting at this idea that if it's really just taking a screenshot of the game and AI image generating a enhanced version of that, is there any... so if something goes off screen, we don't know that that's casting a light or anything like that, right? So is this just a screen space effect? The answer is DLSS 5 only takes the rendered frame and motion vectors as inputs. So yeah, it is just looking at the rendered frame and doing what it can with that. I've noticed some people comment on it. Looks like there's a lot of vignetting around the edges of the video frames that we have of this, and I would agree with that. So that's the issue with a lot of screen space effects in games, is it doesn't always know what to do at the edges of the screen. Anyway, if it was actually understanding the 3D geometry and the environment, there was some kind of BVH structure that it was aware of, like with ray tracing, see, that would be a whole different thing. But this sounds like it is just taking a screenshot of a game and enhancing it at a fast enough frame rate to still be playable, at least currently on 250-90s. Anyway, so my final question, I wasn't sure if I should include this, but it's related to other information that came out at GDC, right? That's the conference that's happening. Anyway, I said, with the introduction of DirectML to DirectX, allowing for hardware-agnostic acceleration of machine learning tasks in games, does Nvidia plan to continue with vendor-locked versions of their machine learning-based game technology like DLSS 5? Or will Nvidia allow these models to run through DirectML on any hardware? In other words, what I'm saying here is another huge criticism of this technology is that it's trying to lock people into NVIDIA specifically, right? Which obviously you understand from NVIDIA's perspective why they would view that as a positive. But from a game developer's perspective, we've seen a lot of push that, the next console generations from both Sony and Microsoft have mentioned neural rendering. Now, whether they mean this kind of neural rendering, where it's literally just taking screenshots of the game and feeding them into an AI, generative AI, I don't know if that's what they mean. But my thought is, are game developers, if they are trying to preserve any of their sort of artistic intent through this kind of a thing, are they going to have to think about all the different various models that might be proprietary? I was really excited with the announcement of DirectML as part of DirectX, because the idea is that some of these machine learning-based technologies don't need to be vendor-locked anymore if the people creating them are on board. So that's what I'm asking. Is NVIDIA still going to vendor lock technologies? Because you're kind of running out of the excuse that, well, there's no open standard, blah, blah, blah. The response is that they have nothing to announce on this at this time. So that doesn't mean no, but it certainly doesn't mean yes. Okay. All right. So what is my final takeaway from all of this? So my biggest issue is this question, is they talk about preserving artistic intent. But since they have clarified that it's essentially literally just feeding a screenshot of the game, that's your rendered frame, as a 2D image into some sort of generative AI, which outputs another 2D image that is trying to be enhanced and more photorealistic. And no matter what you say about it, it does produce more photorealistic images. The problem is that those images often don't look like the original art, right? And they don't necessarily preserve the artistic intent. And there's all sorts of other issues, and we can talk about the use of generative AI and like the ethics, etc. Honestly, I need to kind of get this video over with because I've got other things to get done right in a few minutes here. But my point is, okay, if they're trying to say that there's artistic intent that can be preserved, but I ask them, if the artist views this as the output and doesn't like it, can they ask it to change anything specific about it other than the color grading? And the answer currently appears to be no, unless I'm misreading this statement. So I think that is the exact opposite of preserving artistic intent, because there's a lot that goes into artistic intent beyond color grading. Let me know what you guys think of all of these responses. I do want to say that I am interested in neural rendering more in the format of what we were seeing with like neural texture compression, neural materials, things like that aren't so much a generative AI just taking a screenshot of your game and deciding what it thinks that should look like, with artists having basically no control over that. That I have serious problems with. Now, I will say thank you to Nvidia and Jacob Freeman for being open to answering these questions and making it very clear that is what DLSS 5 is doing. It is taking a screenshot of your game, essentially, a 2D rendered frame, plus motion vectors to understand where it's going in the next frame, and the generative AI is deciding what everything should look like, with no actual knowledge of the game engine or anything in that, or the actual underlying model beyond the 2D image that it sees. And the artists, if they don't like it, want to say, hey, there shouldn't be hair there, this was a straight line buzz cut, the answer is it sounds like they can't do anything about that, if that wasn't their artistic intent. The training data, people with hairstyles like this must have had hair there. So that's what you get. All right, let me know what you guys think in the comment sections. I hope all of you have an excellent day.